Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our Around the World webinar series. Today we have a webinar from the Policy Working Group on the Europeans' Fifth Freedom Goal, Science in and for Europe. So our webinar, so first of all, maybe most of you know me. So I'm Theodota Lagouri and I'm chair of the Policy Working Group. And I have with me Magda Theodoridou, that is the Science Policy Task Force leader to help us with Q&A. So the agenda of today, I will give just a brief introduction, introducing our speaker and just a few elements of what we are doing in MCAA in relation to the science policy and Europeans' fifth freedom. And then Thomas Sturm will have his talk with the title, The Europeans' Fifth Freedom, Science in and for Europe. And then, of course, we will continue with questions and answers and discussion. So I would like, just for the people that are not members of MCAA, just at a glance, a few elements. What is MCAA? Is a global network of researchers who currently benefit or have benefited from the European Commission's MCAA research funding. So currently it's a very large organization, has more than 24,000 members from more than 155 countries. And there are researchers from all career stages and from diverse research fields. So the principles of our organization of MCAA and our vision is to create an inclusive and sustainable research environment that enables knowledge and benefit also society. So our mission is to bring together the MCA community to support the career development of present and past beneficiaries at all career stages, as I said, and to have a common voice to express the researchers from across regions and disciplines. So the main pillars is, of course, networking, but mainly career development and centralized in science policy topics. So for policy, what we are doing, we advocate for research interest. We help science policy and promote fair but also inclusive research careers for the benefit not only of scientific community but society at large. And how we are doing that, we collect evidence-based insights. We shape the future of the program of Marie Sklodowsky-Curie, and we engage with the European research community. So we try to connect researchers to policymakers and also leverage key memberships. So you can see that in about a year, we have published 3 policy feedback reports. We produced 4 joint statements and submitted response also to open feedback European consultations. So our role is to represent the fellows and address their needs in the European science policy sphere. So our key topics, of course, is the MCA fellowships, the excellence, inclusiveness, and impact on research careers, the researchers' careers to be sustainably attractive and transparent. Also, we are busy with researchers' mental health. We care about fair working conditions, quality supervision, and researchers' well-being, and gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. Of course, research assessment is a very important part of our work for fair and inclusive evaluation that recognizes collaboration, openness, and societal impact. But we also focus on science diplomacy topics where international collaboration can address global challenges and reinforce Europe's competitiveness. Our central core, of course, is open science. So we care about transparency, accessibility, and collaboration through open practices and open access. And in general, for research and innovation, we try to contribute to research and innovation European competitiveness through knowledge mobility. just a scheme of our stakeholder community, our memberships. You can see several organizations that you already know. We are part of the ERA Forum, QUARA, the European Science Diplomacy Alliance, the International Science and International Science Council, and also Young Academies, but also we have several partnerships and our collaborations with Eurodoc and other Erasmus Mundus Association and other young academies. More specifically for the MCAA Policy Working Group that we are organizing this webinar today, we support and contribute the general MCAA policy that I presented before and the advocacy activities. And we have created two task forces, one on science policy and one in science diplomacy, and promote capacity building and training for both, organizing several science policy events and science diplomacy and webinars. So just to give some hints why the fifth freedom matters, because propose the freedom of knowledge within Europe, support the free circulation of knowledge and innovation as well, enhance the mobility of researchers, connects the European research area and European single market integration that's already proposed before, and addresses fragmentation in European research systems. So you see it's quite close to MCAA and our core principles. So we have two complementary dimensions in European research area. It's the science policy that trying to improve internal functioning of research systems, funding frameworks, research careers infrastructures, but also science diplomacy with international engagement of research systems, global collaboration, and knowledge and exchange. So the fifth freedom sits exactly at the intersection of these two dimensions that we are also working on. And just one slide about more specifically for science diplomacy, since the webinar will focus more on science policy. So why the fifth freedom is important? Because it strengthens the science diplomacy, but also science diplomacy supports the goal, the fifth freedom goal. As fifth freedom integrates the European research area, empowering researchers as global actors, enhances the Europe's scientific influence and partnerships, and on the other hand, science diplomacy facilitates this international research collaboration, enables the mobility of researchers and exchange of knowledge, builds trust between research systems and institutions, and strengthens the dialogue between scientists and policy makers. And so I will go to our speaker introducing. Today we have Professor Thomas Sturm that was very kind to be with us today and explain more about the European fifth freedom dimension and the connection with the European research area. He's a research professor at Universitat Autonoma de Barcelona. He's member of Academia Europea, and his research areas are focusing on philosophy of science, history of science, and also science policy, of course. And he's main contributor to discussions on the Europeans' fifth freedom and, of course, ERA and via the European Citizen Action Service. And he's going to explain more about these terms. So thank you for your attention for my introduction, and I hope you really enjoy and find interesting today's webinar, and then at the end we can have a Q&A and more discussion about the topics that Professor Thomas Sturm is going to engage with us. So thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Stop sharing.
I should start sharing my own slides. And this mode. Okay. I hope everybody can see the slides right now well.
Yes, thank you.
You can hear me well, and that's very fine. Thank you so much, Theodota and Ashish and the whole team for inviting me to this. I'm very fascinated to be here and very happy. And I would like to explain my perspective on the European Union's so-called fifth freedom hereby today. And what I would like to say only at the beginning is, next to what Theodota said about my work, normally this is work that I wouldn't do. I'm a early modern scholar. I work on Immanuel Kant's philosophy. I work on philosophy of cognitive science, theories of reasoning and rationality. But I came into this because I was invited by a German-Spanish research network that was inaugurated by the German embassy in Madrid. And they asked us one thing at the beginning of the first meeting. What are the stumbling blocks that slow down or even prevent the collaboration between German and Spanish scientists? And me and my friends here in Barcelona, we started thinking about that. And if every one of us had encountered this or that problem, we began to make a list. And after a few moments, it became clear to us, these are problems that are not exclusive to the relation between Spain and Germany, but they have a thoroughly European dimension. And then after discussing these things back and forth, I was brought to the attention by a friend, a colleague in Germany who works for the German Research Council. The German Research Council advises the German federal government and the governments of the 15 federal states in Germany on matters of science policy, on the development of universities, on career development for academics and things like that. And he brought to my attention this concept of a fifth freedom, and that's the ideal framework for addressing these problems of scientific collaboration and cooperation across borders, at least inside the European Union. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So my webinar or talk has a fivefold structure. Of course, the fifth freedom is a topic that leads us to science policy, to the administration of science, the funding, career management, and so on. And these are all basically administrative or bureaucratic topics. And the work that has to be done there is, in my view, mostly at these levels, at working on the bureaucracy and the administration of science in the European Union. And that's what the sociologist Max Weber would call the drilling of hard and thick boards that politics often is. But I want to take us a step back today and explain to you the bigger picture that is important for understanding why we are where we are with the European research area and the fifth freedom, what the background framework for all of this is. And basically, this is the section 1, where I will explain some essential features about modern science that make it intelligible to us and that also motivate, hopefully, why we need the European research area, not only as it is, but in a much better way in the future. In section 2, then I explain a central topic of the European Research Area Act that the European Commission is currently preparing and is planning to present at the end of this year, namely the fifth freedom concept. And that concept is being used in many documents by the European Commission, the Parliament, the Council, and various stakeholders in the European Union. But the concept is often not used in a very clear way. I will explain the unclarities in terms of the extension of the concept, the content, the justification, and problems of its implementation. I will then, in section 3, particularly focus on problem of its implementation. How do we implement the fifth freedom? And that will lead to very concrete examples, will lead back to the problems of science administration in the European Union in terms of the problems that are faced by people in pre- and postdoctoral research career levels and job applications up to the level of professorships of the highest grade, issues of grant mobility and institutional collaborations across the border in the European Union. I will also say in a very practical manner then in section 4, what can be done next? And this leads to the organization that I mentioned, that was mentioned by Theodota, and that I'm mainly working with. That is my strongest team. That's the European Citizen Action Service, a non-profit organization in Brussels. We have built a web page together that will work as an interface between scientists in the European Union and science policymakers. And in fact, it's already beginning to do its work. And I will finally close by just outlining the ERA Act process that is planned. It began in the last year. And according to the political circles that I'm working with in Brussels, the plan is to have a deadline in 2028, by which time the ERA Act is going to be politically accepted after political negotiations in Parliament and Council, and then hopefully the fifth freedom becomes implemented. So background, section 1. I want to talk a little bit about some very basic facts about science in the modern world, or modern science. Since the Enlightenment, we have seen an immense growth of science that has brought us to where we are right now. Everybody knows about the scientific revolution that began with mainly the revolution in astronomy, but was then extended to other disciplines such as mechanics and various other parts of physics, chemistry, biology, and the social sciences up until today. And in this process, science became organized, became put into communities and institutions, such as new academies that were founded, especially since the 17th century, observatories, more universities. Of course, we have universities in the Middle Ages already, but the number of universities increases dramatically in Europe, especially, and interestingly, after the 30 Years' War. New titles are being introduced, such as the official professor and the doctor. These did not always exist before. And academic work is being distributed and communicated through new journals, and science becomes also more specialized through new disciplines. And in this way, science is becoming systematic. It's characterized by a systematicity of its knowledge. This is an idea that was introduced by the philosopher Immanuel Kant first and refined in more recent decades by the philosopher of science Paul Heuninger-Hühne. And it means basically that all areas of nature and society are studied in various levels, at various levels, from data collection, from theoretical explanation, to the epistemic justification, to critical evaluation of knowledge terms, to the organization of science, to the public distribution and communication and discussion of science, is always done in systematic. And science is not categorically, but gradually distinguished from common knowledge in these ways. Systematicity in these senses is also what explains why science has entered so many domains in science and become so successful. Another way to express that is that science has become a system of public knowledge in two ways, at least. It is accessible to the public through education and means of communication, and it is usable for public goals and values, as in law, in medicine, industrial technology, education, and also, let's not forget that, in democratic discourse. We would not have the kind of society that we have today without the social sciences and philosophy. And another factor that is particularly characteristic of science as it develops in the 20th century, it becomes what sociologists and philosophers have called big science. Everybody knows about the Manhattan Project, the NASA, ESA, CERN, the Human Genome Organization, the International Panel for Climate Change, and also digital humanities. When science was done in the Middle Ages and also in much of early modernity by more or less isolated individuals, this has completely changed in many disciplines and also beyond the STEM sciences, as I want to say. And through this systematicity and through its public successes, science has created what we nowadays call the knowledge society. That's a term that goes back to the American sociologist Robert Lane. And here you have a quotation from one of his first publications about this. And he says that the knowledgeable society is a distinctly modern phenomenon. It has inherited a body of knowledge of man, nature, which has been continually created and reversed. And and it has had demonstrable successes in implementing whatever purposes it is applied to. All countries are now devoting increasing resources to scientific investigation, and that's in 1966. At the same time, even though he says it's a worldwide phenomenon, science at that time and well into our time is funded and administered mostly by nation states today, despite its increasingly international nature. Of course, we have in, for instance, the natural sciences, the SI system of units and so on. That's an international affair. Knowledge is widely publicly available, at least across borders in university organizations, through journals and other ways of communication. But the funding and the administration is up until today done mostly by nation states. And you can see the whole process of the European unification, the European research area, as a first attempt to overcome this national organization of science. One of the first promoters of this unification of the European collaboration in science was the sociologist and second European Community Research Commissioner, Ralph Dahrendorf. And Jacques Delors then in the 90s, while he was building the single market of the European Union with its four freedoms, that is the freedom of persons, goods, services, and capital to move freely across European borders, the abolition of tariffs and trades and so on, he said remarkably in a speech to the European Parliament, in which he outlined the broad lines of Commission policy, that it is necessary to have a fifth freedom, and that he even called perhaps the most important freedom of all, the freedom to exchange ideas and experience in 1989. That is how far back our ideas go. But nothing ever like that was created. There is no fifth freedom of knowledge up until today, as opposed to the four freedoms of the single market, which in many ways are also not perfectly realized, but at least they are enforceable rights of European citizens. You, as a European citizen, are able to move to any other European country and take residence there without applying for a visa, for instance. And the other following research commissioners, such as Philippe Busquin, continued that idea and developed it into the concept of a European research area that was presented in 2000. And up until today, this era is but an aggregate of interlocking research programs and agreements concerning science, from the European Research Charter to the European Research Council, the Euraccess and EuroHawk agreements and things like that. But they mostly contain organizations, and there is no ERA organization in Brussels, such as we have with the ERC, for instance. And the regulations that are contained today under the heading of ERA are regulations. That is, they have no direct legal force. They are only directives. Yeah? That is, the European Union sets certain goals, but the European member states do individually their own policy as to how far and how fast and in what ways they realize the regulations that are being issued by the European Commission. And Janis Potočnik, this is a person that I'm mostly working with about these topics, presented this or revived the notion of freedom of knowledge from Delors' idea, and said it would be the free mobility of knowledge, researchers, and also research funding and technologies. Sometimes, and we will come back to this later, other ideas are included under that as well. But this was already contained in the Treaties on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 179. And it's stated very clearly that these things are supposed to circulate freely. In 2007, we know that the ERC was founded, another organization that's considered part of the ERA project. But subsequent documents since after Potočnik's position as EU Research Commissioner keep stating that the ERA and the fifth freedom are far from being realized. And we have to understand why that is the case. Many of these documents speak, for instance, about the fragmentation of R&D. And when you explain it to people, or when you state it to people outside European policy-making circles, no one really knows what is being meant. And maybe you are of the same kind, and maybe you will, after this talk, see more clearly how far that affects your own work and life as academics. So it's most important, I think, to distinguish between two different contexts in which this fifth freedom concept plays a role. On the one hand, we have the idea that it is there to promote science in Europe, to create a European research area in which national borders are irrelevant, with the goal of having the European Union as the globally best realm, the best competitor for science. Remember, if you have seen that Ursula von der Leyen's recent State of the Union address, where she said that scientists across the world, and we know what we're talking about, should choose Europe for that. Someone has tried to admit, so I can continue. The second domain or context in which the aim of a fifth freedom plays a role is the idea that the single markets for freedom have to be complemented by this freedom of knowledge, because we live in a knowledge society, in an information society, or in a knowledge economy. Our economies, our well-beings are mainly driven and increasingly driven by new knowledge. And so the goal here is a different one, is better socio-economic and political innovations and strengthening of the single market, and thereby overcoming what is often in these circles also called the European paradox. The European states and the European Union invest a lot of money into research, but the rate of innovation is, compared to the per capita investments, lower than, for instance, in Japan or the United States. And by introducing the fifth freedom, by removing these barriers to mobility of researchers and to the access to knowledge, the idea is that this European paradox might be overcome. So in 2026, in fall, we will see an ERA Act that is supposed to deal with these issues. And there is a natural connection between these two things, of course. Science has made in history possible innovations, and the more freedom scientists have, the better they can innovate, one might argue. But of course, this argument or this connection, desirable as it may seem, has problems. Namely, we can ask ourselves whether the science is very broadly understood, where we include literature or humanistic disciplines, including my own field, philosophy, or the history of science, or cultural studies. Do they always innovate in the way in which it would be necessary to overcome the European paradox? Probably not. We do these kinds of studies for their own sake or for very long-term interest in keeping up a certain level of education and public discourse. The second problem that there is should we make the freedoms of scientists really dependent on the ability to improve our societies through improving innovations for industry and technology? That is a question that should be asked. And also, should scientists, on the other hand, being paid by the public often as they are, not also serve them? So there is a dilemma here that we should face and that we should think about, and which is important. I will come back to this at the end, because there is an interesting guiding idea that needs, in my view, to be included in the ERA Act. So the European documents are unclear about the fifth freedom goal in various ways, 4 of which I have identified. First, there's a question about which countries will be really included. As you know, the European Union is one kind of international organization or federation, but they are associated with the European Union various other kinds of communities, such as the European Economic Area, which is the 27 states plus 3 others. The ERC countries go far beyond the European Union. And then there is also the question whether we will have only the EU citizens enjoying the fifth freedom, or also their residents. As to content of the fifth freedom, the 2 things that are frequently mentioned that seem to be rather uncontroversial is that the fifth freedom must help to implement better open access, because knowledge that is publicly funded should be available to the public in more free ways and not behind paywalls, and that researcher mobility must be increased. But what about the technologies that have to move between different European countries? There are in university interests, for instance, that might sometimes impede the movement of laboratory equipment, and that need to be discussed. Then the issue about educational system. Do we include all levels of education or only some? And also, what kind of innovations do we want to be able to move freely between the European Union member states? Justification is a big issue that is not very clearly addressed in the papers by policymakers in the European Commission. And mostly the justification is to overcome the European paradox, as I meant, but I want to propose that one should have a more systematic approach here and to think about the functions of the fifth freedom in 4 different areas, namely for scientific progress on the one side, for itself, for promoting scientific research and its advancement. Then secondly, for the freedom of research, for the economy and societal well-being, but also then finally, fourthly, for a better democracy and for the European integration project. And then another topic that's not very clearly stated or clarified in the documents is how to implement the fifth freedom. On the one hand, you might think this is something that should be done through the ERA Act, and then we at the bottom, so to speak, or on the ground, follow the guidelines, but that's not how the political process is going to work, in my opinion. The European Commission and the Parliament and the Council will play a leading role. They have partly different interests. The European Commission and the Parliament are basically fully behind the ERA Act and the fifth freedom. But in the Council, there are certain questions that will be raised and that will constitute some kind of resistance against the fifth freedom. And beyond that, also academic organizations, academic stakeholders and their representatives, and us academics ourselves, we have to work in order to implement the fifth freedom. And I will give you some idea of what we can do ourselves. I will start with briefly with the problem of extension. So this is the European higher education area, or the Bologna system, as it was built since 1999. And you can see here that there is a problem. If we let researcher mobility allow fully freely without feeling any national borders at all beyond the European Union, then some countries will be included that we might not want to have there. And also, this map is a little bit outdated already. The Bologna system has changed, and Russia is seeking its own development right now outside of the Bologna system. But even if you leave these more questionable countries outside and look at our classical partner countries, there is a variety of countries that might be included. It's clear that the ERA Act will first address and be implemented inside the 27 European member states, but then there are questions about the EEA additional countries. These are Iceland, Norway, and you can barely see that, Liechtenstein. But then there are also the Horizon 2020 countries here on the other side. As you see, they reach beyond this circle, and actually there is the big question, also the unknown, that Britain is not contained in either of these communities. Will it become a member of the ERA Act? Yes or no? Horizon is going to expand, and Britain has been reintroduced. But as you can see on this map, in the next Horizon Europe program, even non-European countries, clearly non-European countries, will be included. And again, we will have to ask, will that freedom refer to European citizens, to European residents, or even to people beyond that? And that is nowhere nearly explained in the political discussion so far and needs to be discussed. This is a legal discussion that needs to be held at that level. Content. I will only mention that there are these varieties. What do we apply the notion of free mobility to? Actually, in the case of knowledge, it's not so much mobility that is being required in the classical sense, but open access, of course. And here the question is, when we look at knowledge, the main question is, do we really want all knowledge that is publicly funded by the European taxpayers through, for instance, the Horizon program? Do we want that to be accessible to everyone beyond the European Union as well, when we think about forms of open access publications? Or do we also think that in certain areas we need to have limitations? One thing that is clearly being discussed right now is the issue of sensitive technologies that have to deal with military industry and so on and so forth. Researchers, I said already that what is necessary to know here. And the preliminary proposal, as far as being discussed right now in Brussels, to my knowledge, is that we will have an analogy to the 4 freedoms of the single market, the free mobility of persons, services, and capital. And the 5th freedom is a special freedom. Thus, it will be a right of you, or a set of rights. And it will be a freedom for the outputs of science, open data and open access to knowledge. This is relatively uncontroversial, but there is a lot of blurriness around these things. And the freedom of for the processes of generating that output, that is the free and equal mobility of researchers. I put an emphasis here on the word equal, because that will be very important for the things that I will discuss. And research funding is a very tricky thing, as you will see as well. The implementation or the application of the principle money follows researchers of the ERC grants, how to apply that to national grants is a very tricky and controversial issue. That is the one that will probably create most resistance in the European Council, in my view. So the issue of justification, very briefly, more you can read about that more in my article in the European Review that was published last year. So instead of only thinking about the task of solving the European paradox, creating more cash value, so to speak, from the investments that the European member states and the European Commission make into science, I think that we should think about this from the ground up. Namely, how does the 5th freedom help to advance science? And you can think about this in analogy to the 4 freedoms of the single market as they exist. As Brexit has shown, the 4 freedoms have created added value of growth in the economy. And if you leave the 4 freedoms now, if you leave the single market, your economy declines. And in a similar manner, you might think that if we reduce national barriers, if we reduce bureaucracy in science administration and the mobility of science, that will give us more time for doing the work that we actually ought to do, that is to create new knowledge. And in this way, the 5th freedom will help to advance science. But more than that, because it helps us to create more knowledge, it will also help us to promote the freedom of research in the way that, for instance, we can produce better arguments. We can produce stronger arguments that are more convincing in public discussions and that will protect the scientific system itself in a better way. So in my view, the ERA Act should also contain a clear statement about the freedom of research in its first articles, I think. And then we get to the point when we have that secured, where the 5th freedom can help to advance societies through the innovations that are made possible by new scientific knowledge, and also to support democracy and the European integration project. More on that, as I said, in the European Review paper, because I want to come to the issue of the implementation and what it means to reduce the fragmentation of R&D in the EU 27. That is the core practical task. So I will give you now a list of very concrete problems that people at various levels in the academic system, in the scientific system, face. And this will be very concrete examples, because I asked a number of colleagues. Remember that I stated at the beginning that this work started with collaboration between Spain and Germany. That was evidence that was given to me in the form of qualitative vignettes of short descriptions. So for instance, an Italian doctoral student coming to Spain has to obtain, up until today, different sworn translations of university documents and qualifications for starting her doctoral grant and position over here. They can't just go over to Spain, take their residence, which they can as European citizens, but they have to do a lot of paperwork to start their actual research, sorry. And this has costs, 1,000 euro for each foreign PhD student, approximately. This is not required of Spanish students. this is not required of Spanish students. And you may ask why that is the case. An alternative, which some universities in the EU still require, even from EU citizens wishing to enter doctoral programs in countries that are not their own countries of citizenship, is the Hague apostille. And that's the same type of bureaucratic complexity and financial cost for junior researchers. In Spain, a very particular thing, if a postdoctoral researcher wins Ramón y Cajal Fellowship, that's the most prestigious postdoc position, and then wishes to sign a contract, the ministry or the university, that's actually not clear who is the culprit here, require that they have a número de identidad de extranjero. So that's a kind of identity number. And they can get this number only if they have evidence of already being a resident in Spain. However, usually you cannot take up your residence without already having an NIE. So there is a kind of paradox here. The Spanish administration at the moment offers a provisional NIE, but that subsequently has to be made permanent, a secondary bureaucratic process that in my view is unnecessary bureaucracy. A simple EU passport or an ID should suffice for signing the contract, and then you go on with doing the residence requirements. And that comes along with, in Spain, with the homologization that is similar to the bureaucracy that I mentioned earlier of PhD titles, and a cost per person between 600 and 1,000 euros. Organizations are in place here in Spain that deal with these additional bureaucracies and do this work. Job applications, 2 examples. In the Italian process for the qualification of university professor, the Abilitazione Scientifica Nazionale, in the area of humanities and social sciences, only publications in journals listed by the Italian National Agency of Evaluation, the ANVUR, are counted. And ANVUR lists only few non-Italian journals. Many prestigious international scientific publications are left out. Now think about if you want to apply for a university professorship in Italy, and you're an Italian perhaps even, but you have spent a couple of years abroad at postdoctoral positions, and you have learned that it's good to publish in non-Italian journals, but you're working in the humanities and social sciences, and then you have a clear disadvantage over applicants that have stayed inside of Italy and published only in these journals, but also more broadly, someone who is a non-Italian inside the European Union has a clear disadvantage and is discriminated in this way in comparison to Italian applicants. Another rather dramatic example is for later career stages. A Spanish professor who was already advanced in his career won a competition for a position at the Sorbonne in Paris, so a chair position. And during the contract negotiations, the administration explained to that person that the 25 years that he had already spent in the Spanish academic system would only count 50%, that is 12.5 years, towards his future pension. He ultimately declined the position and remained in Spain. So this is an example of how French researchers are protected, or how the French academic system is sealed off from non-French applicants. In theory, they can go, but they will go only with the price of significant disadvantages compared to French nationals. And that leads clearly, as this example shows, to reduced researcher mobility. An example from Germany, and that concerns National Research Council. So the German National Research Council, the DFG, that it actually allows foreign co-PIs within the framework of what is called the priority programs, SPPs. But it requires that there is a Germany-based co-PI. It doesn't have to be a German professor, but it has to be someone who is at a German university professor, so that the funding can remain at the German university. But this option, which is, okay, minimally good, is linked to a special extra rule or condition. The foreign co-PI must prove that the individual project is essential or necessary for the success of an entire priority program. Priority programs, you must know, are not projects where you just apply for an individual grant, but are such that you have a framework on a general scientific topic, and then people apply, and there is a whole set of like 30 or 40 projects that are contained under this priority program. And you, as a foreign co-PI, must then prove that your individual project is much more important than any other individual project that is otherwise accepted. And this rule is not justified in any way, and no criteria are given for its application. And it has a discriminatory effect on EU researchers that are not based in Germany, but also, more importantly, it's counterproductive for knowledge mobility and scientific progress, because the DFG deprives itself thereby of the expertise of researchers not based in Germany. Institutional collaborations, for reasons of time, I will leave this out, but it was basically about the different personal structures between the German Max Planck Society and the Spanish CSIC. They were unable to found a joint institute around 2000, and because the Max Planck Institutes, they hire academics overwhelmingly on a temporary basis, whereas the CSIC more on a permanent basis, and no compromise could be found, and therefore this kind of European collaboration was made impossible, right? So different organizational traditions and practices in the European Union can block the free flow of researchers, their knowledge, their expertise, their methods, and their means of research. And again, this impedes collaborations and progress. So in sum, researchers from EU countries, believe it or not, who are applying for doctoral, postdoctoral scholarships, academic jobs, and grant applications, they face a lot of national, administrative, linguistic, and financial obstacles that citizens of the EU country that's offering the scholarship or grant do normally not face. And that's not only inefficient, it's also often discriminatory. And one must look, of course, on a case-to-case basis. That's why it's important to collect this kind of evidence and to determine what the right objection is and who the culprit is and what has to be done to overcome the relevant rule, or sometimes it's not even an explicit rule, sometimes it's just a habit or a practice in a national academic system. Remember again the two functions of the fifth freedom, science in Europe and science for Europe. That means we need to address both inefficiencies and discriminations. Discrimination simply because it's a right as a European researcher to enjoy full free mobility, and inefficiency because it impedes scientific progress and the rate of innovation that's made possible by scientific progress. And my proposal is, if EU member countries wish to uphold certain rules and practices that discriminate in some way or another, or that pose these inefficiencies, from now on, after 2026 or 28, the burden of proof should be placed on them, right? It should not be any longer the default that national countries inside the European Union can impose all sorts of rules and practices, and then we face the situation that we have with the fragmentation of the R&D system inside the European Union. That is in part what it means to move from a mere directive to a regulation in the European Union. So some concrete proposals, what we ought to do, and I really invite you all to become active and engaged in this. We need a campaign for informing science organizations and individual academics concerning these topics. We need a campaign for awareness in scientific organizations for hidden and open forms of discrimination. Some of these things, if you think about the announcements of jobs that are sometimes hidden on the web pages of universities, that are not easy to find, that is a form of hidden discrimination. An open form of discrimination was the one that I mentioned with the French pension system. We need to make aware that there are these forms of discrimination, as we have been active in our political systems for the removal of discriminations in other terms. For instance, concretely, we need evaluation systems, better evaluation systems for bachelor and master degrees that need to be fully unified throughout the Union. We need to reduce the costs for student mobilities. The institutions in the EU should issue bachelor and master certificates, also always and by default in English, so that you don't have translation costs, for instance. Doctoral titles from certified universities should become generally accepted. These 2 points are nowadays discussed under the idea that there will be a European researcher pass that will enable people to do all these things without having to face the national bureaucracy. This is the same then for the, European doctorate. In application processes, unnecessary national documents that act as bureaucratic barriers, however small, should be abolished. And the information concerning national calls for doctoral and postdoctoral scholarships open to EU citizens and beyond must be accompanied by complete English translation. Very often, in my case, in Spain, the announcements are only in Spanish, or they are difficult to find in the English translation, or the accompanying materials, such as the frequently asked questions, are only presented in one or two languages, Catalan and Castellano, for instance, and not in English as well. This must end. And then think about the mobility of doctoral and postdoctoral grants. If they are nationally founded, if the funding comes from some national organization, you can see that this is part of the structural policies of various countries in the European Union. And they want to keep their own. But think about this, the Marie Curie scholarships themselves are given to people far outside the European Union, even though it's funded by the European Union. And we should have the same attitude towards national doctoral and postdoctoral grants, in principle at least. But even if that cannot be achieved or not achieved immediately, the duration of possible stays in other European countries could be increased. If, for instance, you have a postdoctoral scholarship that allows you up to now only 3 months of stays abroad, you should go for 6 or 9 months, for instance. And yeah, I leave this aside for reasons of time. And there's more such examples in that article. Someone's trying, every time I'm trying to go on with my slides, someone's coming in and then I have to click again. So you need to learn, we all need to learn not to mechanically accept national regulations that slow down our work or block our research mobility. We need to identify outdated and discriminatory national rules of the kinds that I've mentioned. And then it becomes practical. Write yourself a vignette in the style that I've just presented. Yeah? You find more models in that article that I mentioned, and then upload this to the webpage that I've built with the European Citizen Action Service. This European Citizen Action Service is a wonderful organization. It's non-profit, it's close to the parliament, but independent from it in Brussels. And they offer this. And that's the link to that page. And it's very easy to write just a paragraph. And we are assembling all the incoming evidence and giving it in form of a dossier to the European Commission in the nearby future. Think also about constructive proposals if you want to. What you want the fifth freedom to be? What do you want the European research area to be? Try to think as hard as possible as if you were a policymaker of your own, right? What is feasible? What is desirable? What we also need, and this is something where I might need the help of the Marie Curie alumni in particular, so far my evidence has been partial, and even though it has been complemented by evidence coming in through the Fifth Freedom webpage by ECAS, we need more evidence from a lot of countries. Recent evidence, for instance, has come in addition from Belgium and from France and from Denmark and so on. But we have a certain blind spot in especially the wide era countries, so especially the countries that are in Eastern Europe. They are slow. And I think we need help from the Marie Curie alumni organization, because you are distributed all over these countries and you will know your own examples now. Maybe, hopefully, what I've been telling you has given you an idea of what you could do in the future, what you could contribute. And it's not much work, I hope. What we also need to do is we need to approach governments and science organizations with collected problems and proposals, and this all neatly organized in categories. So I had a meeting in Brussels some months, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and the person in the European Research Commission responsible for the construction of the ERA project said, it's most important that we will learn what the problems on the ground are. If we want to do a good ERA Act by the end of the year, it's important that we get enough feedback from science. So the largest number of evidence that we can get is useful for us and will be useful for creating the ERA Act. Do not worry too much about whether it's clear that your problem fits into the scheme of problems that I've just mentioned. There may be things where I have a blind spot and where I need to learn. This is an experience that I have already had from the incoming input through the web page. But we need to give that to the policymakers in a neat and clear way. So that's why I have a whole team that's helping me to work on this page, and there where we can influence the ERA Act and the freedom. So that's how the web page look, and you'll find it easily if you just type in your search engine Fifth Freedom and ECAS, you will find it. You have some basic information what that is here on these pages. As you can see, what is the Fifth Freedom? Why do we need a Fifth Freedom? And what are two typical obstacles and proposals? There are simple examples, more simple than the ones that I've given. And here you can click on input, and submit it there. It's only 2 boxes that you need to fill out: describe your problem, make a proposal, and you don't have to fill out all of the boxes. Some of them are necessary to give information about and to identify where it comes from and so on, but it will be strictly anonymized. And so the timeline is very simple. The European Commission will present the ERA Act in the end of this year, and then there will be this 2 years long political process for the adoption through the EU institutions. But the relevant actors, as I need to emphasize, they are not only in Brussels. National governments and agencies are relevant actors too, and so are we academics. And so half a century after Ralph Dahrendorf proposed his first ideas, and 40 years after Delors introduced the idea of a fifth freedom, we should finish this time around, but we need to all collaborate. And finally, I close with a bigger idea. How you can see all of this work being helping to do something that is important for us. Many people don't know this, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 contains a right to science and culture. Everyone, every citizen on the planet has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the communities and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the United Nations worked a little bit more on this. We have the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific process and its applications. And the states have, the steps need to be taken. They shall include those steps necessary for the conservation, the development, and the diffusion of science and culture. And you can think about the ERA Act and the Fifth Freedom as the first real political implementation on a trans or international basis of this right to science. When I proposed this in Brussels at the last meeting in December, the persons coming from the EU Research Commission nodded strongly, and they think that's a good idea. So that's basically what I wanted to say. There's a lot of people that I'm working with. This is the team from the ECAS webpage, and I'm dependent on them, and they're doing terrific work over there in Brussels. And there is a wider network of people that have contributed to many of my ideas and works, and organizations that I'm beginning to work with to different degrees and with different kinds of input. Thank you very much. That's it for the moment. Should I stop sharing, or what do you want me to do?
You can just leave your slides. Thank you very much. It was a really very clear, insightful presentation with all, you gave all the perspectives of what exists, what are the problems, and then the implementation that is the most difficult part, of course, because as idea, probably everybody agrees that it's a very nice thing to have, but then in the implementation, of course, now it's open for our audience to pose questions. In MCAA policy, of course, we recognize a lot of these concepts, and we are working for this as well, for ERA Act and for Fifth Freedom. Maybe I should start with what is your opinion after all this? What is a more realistic first approach or mechanism that we should have in place? Is the legislation that is missing? How to impose this on the national countries? Or we have to do first institutional reforms and be ready for something like that? What is practically what you think, what you would suggest?
multi-pronged approach, a multi-pronged approach.
Several layers in several.
I have been so lucky that after the publication of this article, I was approached by ECAS first. They asked me to give talks. The next one is on March the 24th, and it will be a hybrid event, the ECAS State of the Union Day. You can join that online and learn more about that. Commissioner Zarajeva is going to talk, and Janez Potočnik will be at my side, and other people from stakeholders in science. We need to get to people at the European science policy making process, right? That's difficult for individual researchers, but with this network of organizations that are beginning to help, I think we can do it. We can get to the parliament and make our proposals, but we have to do it the best we can as scientists in a systematic and organized way. That's our task. The second task is approach your own home university. Propose events about that at your home universities. Even 2-3 years ago, when I spoke about this for the first time. So Rainer Lange here on the left side of this slide is the person who brought this concept to my attention. And he pointed out that Potočnik had done this work. And when I was approached by ECAS and by another organization that I have not listed here, I need to add that, the Information Lab in Brussels, they brought me into contact with Potočnik. And Potočnik, even though he's out of the commission right now, he's still very active and he knows people, right? Andreu Mas-Collet was also the General Secretary of the European Research Council while Potočnik was commissioner. So with a network of people, you can have discussions and conversations during this 3-year process that we have now and influence them, argue with them, learn from them, do the hard drilling of the thick board, as Max Weber would have said. Go to your own university, ask what they know about the Fifth Freedom and the Air Act. That's the first thing. Go to the webpage, write in your own vignette, your own experience that you had with researcher mobility. Marieke Ries will have that a lot, but maybe also not, because you have been funded with a program that allows for researcher mobility in much easier ways. But in your other career stages, you may have experienced these problems. Write it down. Take your time, take yourself 1 hour somewhere out of your calendar and contribute. We will do that very carefully. This will become a public dossier, and it will go to the Commission. The Commission is basically already waiting for this dossier. And then from there on, we have to work through all these organizations, through the different stakeholders, and create events. The Austrian government is already holding its own ERA Act annual day. Yeah? So when you've done with your university, when you talk to your universities, the universities talk to ministers, to ministries of science and education. Tell them to organize something, to raise awareness that discrimination by national identity can no longer be accepted inside the European Union. That's what we can do, and that's what we need to do. And to my experience, if you do so in a way that is informed about policy making in the European Union, that is informed in concrete ways about what problems we are facing and what good scientists can do to society, you will move a few people, you will get attention, and you will be able to help with your own problems and causes. I should emphasize very clearly that the ERA Act is primarily, remember the problem of extension, for the European Union and its trusted partner states in the European Economic Area, in the ERC, and so on and so forth. These other countries will be appended to the ERA Act through individual negotiations, as it's always done. Remember that Britain rejoined the ERC, the Horizon program, after it has left the European Union. That was an individual negotiation between the European Union, or the Horizon program, and the British government. The British government, through its mission in Brussels, was also the first organization that approached me after the publication of the article. 3 days after that article, they wanted to know what's going on. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Do your own individual contribution, speak to your local agencies and administrations, make them speak to the ministries. We need to work on the national country organizations, the commissions, the ministries, and also find your contexts at the European policy level. And the MCAA is, I gather, an enormously strong organization for that. And I'm really happy that we are beginning to cooperate here.
Yeah, exactly. Since MCAA is exactly this community of mobile researchers at all stages, and we have faced a lot of these problems, even if we are under this program. So I think maybe the audience, maybe they can have some questions and tell us if they have already experienced problems with their mobility, how they see how freely they were moving in different countries. Or do you think that is already accomplished the free circulation of knowledge, let's say, and the
Ask me anything about the political process, about the distinction between directive and regulations, about I don't know everything that's going to be in the ERA Act, besides the fifth freedom, right? Because it's partly something to be discussed. If you have ideas, what should be included, that's something you can ask about, for instance.
Yeah, and we don't know if in how many years this will be accomplished.
Well,
Maybe
the plan is to do this by 2028, by the end of 2028. And Enrico Letta, in meetings, always emphasizes that we need a timeline. Just like we needed a timeline and a deadline in the creation of the single market. This is both, in Letta's view, this is both the completion of the single market through its complement of a fifth freedom. Who knows? Maybe we will discover later on that more freedoms are needed. I don't know that. But it is meant to be the completion or strong improvement of the single market, but it's also at the same time the creation of something entirely novel and stronger through the ERA Act. Yeah? These two dimensions must be kept in mind by us and kept apart, but also seen in conjunction.
So the goal is to be like a formal pillar of a Euro Act, so of ERA Act.
Yeah, the ERA
Act to be accomplished at the end of the. It
means both the ERA Act and the reform of the single market as envisaged by Draghi and Letta. At least as far as Letta is concerned, he told me that Jacques Delors told him the most important thing, if you want to make progress on anything, you have to put a deadline. You have to put a deadline, and because then you will get the actors together and make them do things. Yeah. And there is no reason. So, for instance, I will be talking soon to the Catalan Minister of Science, Innovation and Universities. And I will tell her there is no reason for us not to be proactive here and to abolish the bureaucratic hurdles and regulations that I spoke about in the Spanish case already before the ERA Act. Yeah? The ERA Act should, in my view, put the burden of proof on national administrations and on university. If they want to have a special excuse for themselves, they need to justify it. They need to justify it. It's not any longer the case that national rules for science administration should be the default. They should be the exception. They should become the exception. Yeah? And so things will have to be abolished. Just like with the European single market, we abolished tariffs and trades and border controls. This is the same thing. This is the same practice. It is a process that will be initiated through the ERA Act, that will continue after the ERA Act is politically adopted, but there's also no reason not to start it proactively now, right? Think about pre-docs, postdocs, job applications, collaborations. Where do you find impediments for mobility and for collaboration? Every day I get something new that I had not thought about myself, every day.
New evidence, new cases that you never thought of.
Research groups is another example. We have inter-university research groups, but sometimes our own universities see themselves in competition with one another and try to seal of the mobility of researchers who go to a research group at another university. That's crazy.
Even internally in the same country.
Inside of Spain, we have that. I'm curious, does anyone have an example that they want to contribute and that they maybe want to ask whether that is the case for the ERA Act and the Fifth Freedom or not?
I have one.
Yes.
It's the example that I know it's basically coming from the UK, but I bet it's not the only place where that is the case. So there are in the UK, salary offers for academic positions are usually benchmarked against the researcher's previous salary rather than their experience, and that creates disparities for researchers moving between different national systems. So I had the question like, how could the Fifth Freedom help address these structural inequalities and promote greater transparency and comparability in recruitment and salary setting so that mobility does not disadvantage researchers, basically?
Can you describe more closely country from which you moved there? And
yeah, so my personal example was that I moved to the UK for my individual fellowship named back then after 15 years of experience as a researcher. So I was already an experienced researcher. And when after the end of my Marie Curie fellowship, I was awarded a tenure track research fellowship, which basically was about to lead to an academic position, and the salary. But it's not the only case. I know that this is the standard procedure in the UK, that when you are offered a position, they asked evidence of your previous salary. And in my case, it was not about salary. I mean, it was an MCAA salary, but I had colleagues that had less experience than me, but the salaries in the UK increase every year. That's a standard procedure. You don't need a promotion. It just adds to your previous salary. It's part of the system. And so with a few years of even less than the experience that I mentioned for myself, with less than that, you would have a higher salary if you were a lecturer, for example, for many years. So in the end, I just realized at some point that it was more based on the value, on the number, rather than a holistic assessment of the experience.
And do I understand you in such a way that the years that people have spent in countries with lower income, let's say,
well,
lower product,
yes,
that would count, so to speak, negatively. So you get the same position as someone else, let's say in the UK or in France, but your salary will be reduced because you come from a poorer country in the European Union.
I'm not sure. Well, because my previous salary was the standard salary for an MSCA researcher. Still, it was like I was evaluated as a researcher for only 2 years, like, okay, experienced researcher, but only with a 2-year experience in the UK. But that was not my
in the
global experience. That's what I mean. It doesn't really matter where I was before. What was important was that I didn't have additional experience after the Marie Curie or as a lecturer in the UK. I'm not sure if that is clear. But I guess if you come from another country, then, and if that is a poorer country, for sure, that is also another example. That was not my example, but that's another case. Yeah.
my own case, to be frank about this, I am German and I moved to Spain, and the average salaries for academics are lower in Spain, but also the living expenses are somewhat, in most areas, are somewhat lower in Spain. Not for housing, but especially not in Barcelona area, of course. The ERA Act will not be able to rule everything, but if the one case that you described, that the British were asking whether people came from poorer countries and then adjusted their salaries downward, that would be, for me, a case of at least hidden discrimination. Yeah. I think that salaries should be relative to career stage, connected to living expenses in a country, right? Just like we think about minimal salary.
There are scales, they are institutional and national, but still, like, where you are positioned within that range, because it is pretty broad for its scale.
In the Netherlands, for instance, if someone comes from Germany and gets a job in the Netherlands, where the salaries for professors are considerably higher, the Netherlands would never come up with the idea to reduce the salary for that professor. This is one level across the board. It doesn't matter which country you come from. Right? Just the level of salaries that is there in position in the Netherlands for that level of academic career, without considering where people come from. So considering where people come from in setting the salaries is a strange thing that needs to be looked at. But if you write me a vignette about your case, I will think about that. Sometimes it needs a little bit.
I think it's part of the procedure, because it used to be part of all the application platforms. Yeah. They had a question about your previous salary, your current salary, or whatever, and that is not that. Yeah. Anyway, so I think it's part of the recruitment process and assessment process that is problematic.
Yeah, probably was not recognize your experience outside UK, so they counted only when you were in UK. Yeah. And I think Elena Privio has, she cannot open microphone, but has a similar
question, something that there could be a simple survey among yourselves now, if there are countries who do not do these kinds of things, right? And as far as I know, Spain doesn't do that, the Netherlands don't do that. And so if a country has...
witness that Germany... Sorry, Thomas, we have a witness now. Yes. From Elena Privio, is in the chat. I don't know if you can read your chat, but says that in Germany it happens when a postdoctoral researcher goes to Germany and has a PhD not from Germany, then they put a different scale, the salary that you start as postdoc. So it's not recognized if your PhD is from abroad. In the same, so that is a discrimination.
Sounds very much like a discrimination. I will have to look at
PhD experience.
That is something that you should submit, Elena, please. Yeah, do not worry too much. We even have legal experts working with this in ECAS and beyond, who look at the cases and think about whether that is something that ought to be addressed by the ERA Act or not. Okay, this is a long process, but please submit your information about this.
And sometimes it could be that during their PhD, the German PhD students are already in some scheme, so they pay social security or this kind of things. So in this way, it counts so in the scale to increase their salary next step. And if you have a PhD somewhere outside, so it is this scheme that is not unique all over Europe. European Union. So that could change the scale of how you are hired and which scale. Even the same position, postdoc position, could be lower salary.
So Elena, by any means, this is a good example. Please go to the webpage and submit that, right? You can look over the text that you wrote in the chat and just check its details however you can be precise as much as possible, but we will look. And we will also see if there comes parallel input that is similar. That is also important for us to know. Right? The broader, just as in science, there's a lot of unknown stuff here that people in Brussels don't know, that national governments don't know. that we have this super fragmented R&D system in Europe where one doesn't know what the other side does. And this needs to be straight-lined, at least to a certain extent.
I think maybe it's time to wrap up a bit. I don't see very urgent questions. I think all the people need to think. It was quite interesting information, and your presentation and all the cases that we discuss here. And I think the discussion will be continued also offline on other occasions. Also, we have the annual conference this year in Brussels, and I'm sure these discussions will happen intensively, and we'll have the opportunity. And also, we welcome you to join us in Brussels for this conference, either online or offline. And also inside the policy working group and in science policy, we are going to discuss. So everyone is welcome to continue later.
And I will add in the chat for those who are still here, and you can distribute that as much as you want to, Theodota, the link to the event that is happening in ECAS in Brussels on the 24th of March. As I said, it's a hybrid event with many stakeholders from science in Europe, with the commissioner and other people. And the day it's happening from 9 to 1 o'clock in the morning, and half of that morning will be spent with the Fifth Freedom only. So 2 to 3 hours. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
Just have to register. That's all. It's free and open.
This and also the ECAS page where they can put their comments, witness, and yeah, I'm sure we are going to meet again and discuss and continue our discussion. It was an interesting afternoon spending with you and everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Really, it was very good opportunity to meet you and discuss. So have a nice afternoon, evening, everyone. And I guess we will meet a lot of you us in Brussels for the annual conference, or in the next policy working group. That in the next 2 weeks we are going to have science policy and policy working group, and for sure, Thomas, we are going to discuss this webinar there as well. So thank you very much.
Write me your emails and go to the ECAS webpage. Thank you very much. It was really nice to have you and to learn about the MCAA's work on all this as well. We should really join forces.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Bye.